March 1943. High in the Pyrenees, under a sky without moonlight, a young woman leads 3 exhausted men through snow and silence. None of them are soldiers anymore. They are hunted. One wrong step means capture. One sound means death. She does not carry a weapon. She carries a map in her head, fear in her chest, and the lives of strangers behind her. How did a Belgian girl in her early 20s become the most dangerous path out of occupied Europe? She did not design an escape line and wait safely in the background. André de Jong walked it herself again and again. While most resistance networks relied on couriers to pass messages, she chose something far more dangerous. She personally escorted downed Allied airmen from the heart of occupied Belgium, across France, and over the Pyrenees into neutral Spain. Not once, not occasionally, repeatedly. The distance was brutal. Hundreds of kilometers on foot. Night trains, safe houses that might already be compromised, borders that could vanish overnight. The final stretch, the mountains, was the worst. Snow blinded the path. Hunger slowed every step. Exhaustion turned simple mistakes into fatal ones. If a guide failed, everyone died. If she failed, dozens of future missions died with her. By her early 20s, men twice her age trusted her with their lives. British and American pilots followed her without knowing her real name. They knew only this: if they stayed close and stayed silent, she might get them home. Records later confirmed what whispers had already spread through the resistance. Hundreds of Allied airmen survived because she chose to walk beside them, not ahead of them. Each successful crossing increased the danger of the next. Gestapo patrols tightened. Informants listened harder. The mountains did not care. And still, she kept walking. She was born into a Europe that believed itself civilized. Borders were stable. Trains ran on time. Wars belonged to textbooks and old men's memories. In Belgium, life moved with quiet routines, schools, churches, cafes, under the assumption that order, once built, would hold. That assumption did not survive 1940. When German forces swept across Western Europe, Belgium fell with shocking speed. Streets that once echoed with conversation filled with boots and commands. Flags changed. Curfews arrived. Radios were confiscated. Fear became administrative, printed, stamped, enforced. For many, survival meant adaptation. For others, it meant silence. And for a very small number, it meant refusal. Her upbringing mattered more than history would later admit. Raised in a household shaped by discipline, moral clarity, and responsibility, she absorbed an idea that would quietly define her life. When institutions fail, individuals remain accountable. This was not radicalism. It was conscience. She trained as a nurse, preparing for a life of care, not combat. But war has a way of weaponizing ordinary skills. A steady hand, an observant eye, the ability to endure suffering without turning away. Occupation did not arrive all at once. It crept in. First, uniforms, then restrictions, then disappearances. Neighbors learned which questions not to ask. Trains left stations with fewer passengers than they arrived with. Allied aircraft began to fall from the sky, burning fragments of a distant hope crashing into fields and forests. Some pilots died. Some were captured. A few escaped into the countryside, lost, injured, hunted. That was the turning point. It is easy to imagine courage as a single dramatic decision. In reality, it often begins with something smaller and more dangerous: recognition. She recognized that these men, foreign, wounded, terrified, were not symbols. They were human beings trapped behind enemy lines, abandoned by geography and timing. Hiding them for one night became two. Two became movement. Movement demanded planning. Planning demanded networks. And networks, once formed, demanded leadership. There was no blueprint, no command structure, no assurance of success. What existed instead was a vacuum, an absence of safe passage out of occupied Europe. She stepped into that vacuum before she fully understood its size. Others hesitated. She moved. Early efforts were improvised and fragile. Safe houses depended on trust. Routes changed constantly. One compromised contact could unravel everything. The occupying forces understood this and exploited it ruthlessly. Rewards were offered. Informants recruited. Entire resistance cells vanished overnight. Survival required more than bravery. It required restraint. Knowing when not to act. Knowing when to wait. Knowing when silence was the only shield. She learned quickly that courage without structure was suicide. So she began to build structure, quietly, patiently, not with ideology, but with logistics. Addresses memorized, not written. Names compartmentalized. Roles separated so that no one knew too much. The work was invisible by design. If done correctly, no one would ever know how close they had come to disaster. The psychological toll arrived before the physical one. Every knock on the door could be the last. Every train ride carried the risk of inspection. Every person helped increase the odds of exposure. Yet the alternative, doing nothing, became unbearable. In a world where cruelty was bureaucratic, choosing to help was an act of rebellion. By the time most people around her were still adjusting to occupation, she had already crossed an internal line. This was no longer about patriotism or victory. It was about responsibility. Once she had helped one person escape, she understood the cost of stopping. Survival created obligation. If a path existed, it had to be walked. If it did not exist, it had to be made. History often frames resistance as reaction. In her case, it was initiative. She did not wait for permission. She did not wait for orders. She acted before the danger was fully visible, when retreat might still have been possible. That window would not stay open for long. What began as individual acts of shelter could not survive for long. The occupation was tightening, and improvisation left traces. A single mistake, a careless name, a repeated address, a familiar face seen too often, was enough to collapse everything. If escape was going to continue, it needed to become something else entirely. Not a favor, not a gamble, a system. She understood this before most people around her did. Networks fail when they rely on heroism alone. They survive when risk is distributed, information is compartmentalized, and trust is engineered rather than assumed. So she began to design an escape line that moved like a shadow, present everywhere, visible nowhere. Safe houses were selected not for loyalty alone, but for plausibility. Homes where strangers would not attract attention. Families who could explain an extra plate at the table. Apartments near train stations, but not too near. Every location had to look ordinary, because ordinariness was camouflage. The people involved were given fragments of the whole, never the full picture. A guide knew the next address, not the final destination. A host knew the guest's cover story, not their real name. Movement followed a rhythm dictated by the occupiers themselves. Trains at certain hours were safer than others. Borders shifted between being porous and lethal. Weather mattered. Holidays mattered. The escape line learned to breathe with the enemy's routines, expanding when attention drifted, contracting when pressure increased. Money was scarce. Forged documents were unreliable. Every step carried legal and mortal consequences. If caught, those helping would not simply be arrested, they would be erased. Entire families could disappear. The line demanded a level of commitment that could not be coerced. People had to choose it fully, knowing exactly what they risked. As the network grew, so did its reputation quietly. Allied airmen who survived spoke in cautious tones about a route south, about guides who asked few questions and demanded absolute obedience. Word spread without names. That anonymity was deliberate. Fame was dangerous. Recognition attracted attention, and attention invited death. The most difficult problem was the final barrier. France could be crossed by train, by foot, by luck. The Pyrenees could not. They demanded endurance, local knowledge, and timing. The mountains did not forgive weakness. They were indifferent to courage. Snow could erase paths overnight. Fog could turn familiar ground into a maze. A twisted ankle could doom an entire group. Most resistance leaders would have delegated that risk. She did not. She chose to lead the crossings herself. This decision changed everything. It limited the number of missions, but increased their success rate. Trust solidified when the guide shared the same danger as those she led. She learned every ridge and pass, every point where sound carried too far, every place where exhaustion peaked. Each crossing refined the next. Experience replaced guesswork. The line now had a name, the Comet Line, but names were for after the war. In real time, it was simply a sequence of human decisions made under pressure. A knock answered, a door opened, a train boarded, a mountain climbed. Gestapo intelligence began to notice patterns. Increased escapes meant increased scrutiny. Informants were planted. Surveillance intensified. Entire districts were questioned. The escape line responded by becoming quieter, not faster. Missions were delayed rather than rushed. Success depended on patience as much as speed. By this point, failure was no longer a personal risk. It was systemic. If she was caught, the line would unravel. If the line unraveled, dozens of people would be exposed. Responsibility multiplied with every success. Each life saved added weight to the next decision. She carried that weight without ceremony. There were no speeches, no declarations of purpose. Only movement, only silence, only the understanding that once a path exists, people will follow it, and someone must be willing to walk first. The Comet Line was no longer an idea. It was operational, and because it worked, it became a target. Each mission began the same way and never felt the same twice. A quiet introduction, a false name, a rule repeated until it became instinct. Stay close, do not speak, do exactly as instructed. The men she guided were trained pilots, accustomed to control and authority. Under occupation, none of that mattered. Survival depended on obedience, and they understood it quickly. The journey south unfolded in fragments. Short train rides where every stop felt like exposure. Stations patrolled by uniforms that did not need to recognize faces to recognize fear. Papers checked under harsh light. Seconds stretching into minutes. When the doors closed and the train moved again, no one exhaled. Not yet. Safe houses were pauses, not refuges. Food was scarce and sleep came in broken intervals. The danger did not disappear indoors. It simply changed shape. Walls carried sound. Windows framed silhouettes. Hosts smiled while listening for footsteps on stairwells. No one asked questions that might create answers they did not want. Movement resumed at night whenever possible. Roads were avoided. Fields were crossed without lights, guided by memory and stars. When conversation happened, it was brief and practical. Fear had no vocabulary here. There was only the next turn, the next hour, the next border. The closer they moved toward the Pyrenees, the heavier the silence became. Everyone understood that this was the point of no return. Beyond the mountains lay neutrality and freedom. In the mountains lay exposure, exhaustion, and a geography that answered to no one. She did not soften the truth. She did not promise success. She explained the risks plainly, because false reassurance killed more people than honesty ever could. The ascent stripped away hierarchy. Age, rank, nationality dissolved under the same cold. Snow burned the lungs. Wind erased sound and direction. Boots slipped. Hands went numb. Progress slowed to meters per minute. When someone fell behind, she stopped. Stopping was dangerous, but leaving someone behind was fatal. Every decision balanced momentum against mercy. Night crossings were chosen for concealment, but darkness magnified disorientation. Paths that existed by day vanished entirely. The mountains demanded trust, trust in the guide, trust in the line of bodies ahead, trust that exhaustion would not turn into panic. Panic was the enemy. It drew attention. It broke rhythm. She watched for it constantly, intervening before it took hold. There were moments when the line froze in place, listening. Distant voices, the crunch of snow that did not belong to them. In those moments, stillness became strategy. Breath slowed, muscles locked. Time stretched until danger either passed or arrived. Most of the time, it passed. Sometimes it did not. Hunger became a companion rather than a problem. Rations were calculated, not comforting. Water froze. Sleep arrived only in fragments, leaning against rock, wrapped in silence. Pain was acknowledged and ignored in the same instant. A twisted ankle could end everything. Frostbite was treated with movement, not rest. Survival required contradiction. What made these journeys uniquely dangerous was repetition. Success did not reduce risk, it increased it. Every group that crossed alerted the occupiers that a route existed. Patrols intensified. Informants listened more closely. Border controls shifted without warning. Familiar faces became liabilities. The escape line adapted constantly, changing timing, altering entry points, rerouting entire sections overnight. She adapted with it. Experience sharpened judgment. She learned when to abort a mission and when to push through exhaustion. Turning back meant failure, but pressing forward at the wrong moment meant death. These decisions were made without consultation, without debate. Leadership here was not authority, it was accountability. If she chose wrong, the consequences belonged to her. The men she escorted often remembered her as calm. That calm was deliberate. Fear is contagious. So is steadiness. She rationed emotion the way she rationed food. Nothing wasted. Nothing displayed unnecessarily. In private moments, doubt surfaced. Not about the cause, but about endurance. How many times could this be done before luck ran out? How many lives could be carried before the weight became unmanageable? Yet each successful crossing reinforced the same truth. The line worked because it was human. It relied on judgment rather than rules, adaptation rather than ideology. It survived because people trusted it more than they trusted fear. That trust flowed toward her, whether she sought it or not. The cost of that trust accumulated invisibly. Every face that made it across added another reason not to fail the next. Responsibility multiplied quietly, without ceremony. There were no medals waiting on the other side of the mountains. Only the knowledge that turning away now would leave others trapped behind. By the time she returned north after a successful crossing, the danger did not reset. It compounded. Her presence was becoming known, if not by name then by pattern. A young woman seen too often near borders. A guide who returned when logic said she should disappear. Gestapo files began to thicken with speculation. Networks were probed. Weak points were pressured. The escape line continued to function, but the margin for error narrowed. What had once been daring became precarious. What had been precarious became nearly impossible. And still, missions were planned. Requests kept coming. Downed airmen kept falling from the sky. Saying no would have been safer. It would also have been final. The last thing she allowed herself to believe was that skill guaranteed survival. Skill only delayed exposure. She knew that eventually something would give. A mistake, a betrayal, a coincidence no one could control. The question was not if the line would be compromised, but when and how much damage could be contained when it happened. She kept walking anyway. The collapse did not arrive with an explosion. It came quietly, the way most disasters do, through a series of small fractures that looked harmless on their own. A contact delayed. A safe house that felt different. A question asked one time too many. The escape line had survived patrols, weather, and exhaustion. What it could not fully defend against was human weakness under pressure. The occupiers understood this. They did not need to dismantle the entire network at once. They needed one compromised link, one frightened person, one betrayal born not of ideology, but of fear. Surveillance tightened. Patterns were mapped. The line was studied patiently, professionally, without emotion. This was not revenge. It was procedure. Arrests began at the edges. Couriers vanished. Hosts were questioned. Some did not return. The response inside the network was immediate and ruthless. Routes were suspended, names erased, movement halted. Every delay saved lives, but it also increased suspicion. An escape line that stopped moving drew attention as surely as one that moved too often. She sensed it before confirmation arrived. Experience had trained her to read absence as clearly as presence. Too many doors stayed closed. Too many silences replaced familiar signals. The danger had shifted from hypothetical to imminent. Retreat was still possible. Disappearance was still an option. She did not take it. The arrest came without drama. No chase. No warning shot. Just uniforms where they should not have been, and the sudden understanding that calculation had failed. She was taken not as a symbol, but as a suspect. One more file to be processed, one more resistance figure to be broken for information. Interrogation followed a familiar script. Questions framed as casual conversation. Offers of leniency disguised as reason. Threats delivered with administrative calm. The goal was not confession, it was extraction. Names, routes, addresses, anything that could unravel what remained of the line. She gave them nothing. Silence is often misunderstood as passivity. In this context, it was an active decision, renewed every hour. Every answer withheld forced the interrogators to guess. Every guess risked exposing the wrong people. Endurance became strategy. Pain was no longer personal, it was functional. The longer she remained silent, the more time the network had to adapt, to scatter, to survive. She was moved through prisons and camps, stripped of identity and reduced to numbers. Conditions were designed to erode time, memory, and will. Hunger blurred days together. Fear became ambient, no longer sharp enough to shock. The body learned what the mind already knew. Survival required narrowing focus to the present moment only. What sustained her was not optimism. It was structure. The same discipline that had guided strangers through mountains now guided her through captivity. Control what can be controlled. Accept what cannot. Do not borrow suffering from the future. Do not relive the past. Silence remained the boundary she would not cross. Outside, the damage was uneven. Parts of the escape line collapsed. Others adapted and continued under new leadership. Some of those she had helped were safe, already far beyond reach. Others were caught in the aftermath. There was no way to measure the outcome from inside a cell. Uncertainty became its own punishment. Liberation did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as an ending. When the war finally loosened its grip, survival felt almost abstract. She emerged into a world eager to move forward, to rebuild, to forget. The suffering of individuals blurred into statistics. Silence, once a weapon, became expectation. There were no parades waiting for her, no immediate recognition. The work she had done was designed to be invisible, and invisibility persisted. Files remained classified. Stories were incomplete. Many of those who owed their lives to the line would never know the full extent of what had been risked. She had survived the occupation, the betrayal, and the prisons. What remained was a different kind of endurance, living with the knowledge of what had been done, what had been lost, and what history might choose to remember, or not remember at all. When the war ended, the noise did not fade all at once. Europe moved from gunfire to rebuilding with remarkable speed, as if motion itself could erase memory. Cities cleared rubble. Borders reopened. New flags replaced old ones. The world learned how to breathe again. For those who had lived in secrecy, this return to normality was not relief. It was disorientation. She emerged into peace without a role prepared for her. The work that had defined her years under occupation had no place in public life. It could not be explained easily, and in many cases, it could not be explained at all. The Comet Line had survived precisely because it left little behind. No records meant to endure, no visible hierarchy to celebrate. Recognition came slowly, unevenly, and often felt beside the point. Commendations arrived years later, sometimes decades later, detached from the urgency in which the actions had been taken. They did not restore the people who had been lost. They did not account for the weight of choices carried alone, night after night, without certainty of survival. What mattered more to her were the living consequences. The men who had crossed the mountains and returned to families. The letters that appeared unexpectedly. written by people who remembered fragments, a cold night, a steady guide, a voice that told them when to keep moving and when to stop. These acknowledgments were quiet, personal, and sufficient. She chose not to anchor her life to the past. Instead, she turned towards service again, this time without secrecy. Nursing returned as vocation rather than cover. Later, humanitarian work replaced resistance. The geography changed from Europe to distant regions marked by poverty and disease rather than occupation. But the principle remained the same. Go where the need is greatest. Stay when it is difficult. Leave without asking to be remembered. This choice confused those who wanted a cleaner narrative. Heroes were expected to remain visible, to retell their stories, to embody victory. She resisted that role instinctively. The war had taught her that attention was dangerous, that ego compromised purpose. Silence, once a tool of survival, had become a habit of character. History often measures impact by proximity to power. Her impact existed far from it. It lived in outcomes rather than declarations, in lives extended rather than battles won, in the absence of tragedy rather than its spectacle. This made her difficult to place in textbooks and documentaries that favored clarity over complexity. Yet survival without glory was not erasure. It was continuity. The same values that had driven her through occupied Europe now guided a life built on endurance rather than recognition. She did not retreat from the world. She simply refused to let the war be the only thing that defined her. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was choice. History prefers clean lines, clear victories, named leaders, moments that can be framed and dated. The life she lived resists that preference. Her impact unfolded in margins, between borders, between patrols, between one heartbeat and the next. It left behind survivors, not monuments. The legacy of André de Jong does not rest in the number of medals eventually pinned to her name, though they came. It rests in a quieter arithmetic. Each person who crossed the mountains returned to a life that continued forward. Marriages, children, decades that would not have existed otherwise. These outcomes rarely appear in military histories. They do not look like strategy. They look like absence, the absence of loss. Her story forces an uncomfortable question. How many turning points in history are carried not by generals or governments, but by individuals who refuse to step aside when danger arrives? And why do these people so often vanish from collective memory once the crisis ends? The answer is partly structural. She left few records because records would have killed the line. She avoided attention because attention endangered others. The very traits that made her effective made her difficult to celebrate afterward. Invisibility was not a flaw of her work. It was its design. Another reason is more unsettling. Her story disrupts assumptions about power. She held no official authority. She commanded no troops. She issued no proclamations. And yet, she altered outcomes that states could not. This challenges the idea that history is shaped only from the top down. It suggests that moral clarity, when paired with endurance, can rival institutions. Remembering her is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of correction. It restores balance to a narrative that too often overlooks those who moved history forward without permission. It reminds us that courage does not always announce itself. Sometimes it walks quietly at night, across borders that should not exist, carrying strangers toward a future they will live to see. If stories like hers are forgotten, history becomes smaller than it truly is. And if they are remembered, they expand what we believe one person can do. When silence is chosen, fear is managed, and responsibility is accepted without applause.